Great. Thank you, Judy. So welcome to our session on culture and business communications. My name is Eva Morales. I guess most of you already know who I am. I'm one of your sustainability consultants here in the program. And today we have our guest speaker with us. And I have the pleasure to introduce you to Alan Runciman. He's an expert in intercultural communications. And also my husband. We're doing a session on the sofa, and give it to you so you can introduce yourself, Alan.
Yes, okay. Well, hi everybody. Glad you could join us today. I'm a professor in intercultural communication. I've been teaching for interpreters at university level for the last 20 years. Firstly in Italy. I worked in Italy for 25 years, and for the last 5 years I've been here in Spain, working for the University of Catalonia. I teach language, but I also teach culture, because interpreters, for example, require, I think, a good understanding of cultural differences when they are interpreting in the business world especially. Because language is important, of course, but understanding cultural cues is also vitally important as well. Because culture, I feel, is something that we take. Sometimes we don't see it properly. It's like looking at an iceberg. You see the top of the iceberg and you think, oh, it looks fairly similar up to the horizon, but beneath the surface, there are vast amounts of differences in cultures between people that we need to understand are things that are ingrained from our very beginning of our lives. They're sort of inculcated from our earliest years, and they're things that sometimes are not visible, so to speak.
Very good. So Alan, what comes to mind when you think about differences of cultures in the business world?
I suppose on a very simple level, I would say that the things like proxemics and haptics. Now, proxemics is the science of spatial distance between people in a social context. And haptics is about touch and gesture. And these are things that you see quite immediately when you see different cultures coming together. So, for example, a classic example would be the Japanese person, for example. When Japanese businessmen come together or with their clients, as you know, there's a distance between them, which we refer to as the proxemics, which could be around 1 meter, 1.5 meters even. They bow, but there's no touch, there's no giving of hands or handshakes. If you move to Great Britain, of course, the distance is that. If you go south of the Alps into and Spain, if you know the person, there might even be an air kiss on both sides of the cheek, or even a hug. So it's very different from culture to culture, the way that we greet and interact through this perspective, I think.
This is very interesting because something comes to mind. For instance, when you meeting a client, let's say in a Spanish person meeting someone in Great Britain, because the distance between them makes them uncomfortable if you're too close to them. Sometimes you might be talking to someone too close, and what is in that person's mind is constantly, I need to step away, and they keep backing off you. And so whatever conversation you're having is starting to become uncomfortable. All they're thinking about is, I need to get away, I suppose, what that person is saying. So these subtleties are quite important, aren't they, Alan?
I mean, we've probably heard about the expression, my personal space. And that personal space varies from culture to culture. An interesting anecdote was an American businessman who was a director of a company working in Mexico City. And when his colleagues came in, they were Mexican, they would get very close to him and they would touch him on the shoulder and touch him on the arm. And he panicked. Every day he had a meeting with them, he would panic because they were too close in the personal space sense. They were touching him. An American culture is not usually the case, apart from a quick slap, perhaps, but keeping your hand on his shoulder made him very nervous. So what he would do is, when they came in, he'd put the chairs around the desk to stop them from coming too close. So he thought this is the solution to the problem. But when they came in, they moved the chairs, came around the desk, and gave him a hug. So these are cultural things that you can't get rid of. You can't eliminate them, unfortunately.
But it is true. I think being aware of these differences are important. I find myself, I'll tell you my own experience after working in the United Kingdom for 30 years, which is all my professional life. Even though I have my Spanish culture, but my business culture of doing business, it became very British. And when I came back to Spain, my sense is when I'm greeting someone, I'm going to shake hands. But of course, business people here, they will come and kiss you. And for me, it makes me uncomfortable. So if I sort of shake hands with them, they think that I'm not trusting them, perhaps. And by understanding that, you adapt to the circumstances, you adapt to who you're doing business with by understanding what is important to them. And maybe don't feel so uncomfortable because you know that that's how they operate. So it's a good point. So Alan, tell me, what else comes to mind when you think about cultural norms in doing business?
Yeah, we can divide cultural norms up into three areas. What we call, the first area might be for what we call folk ways, which are to do with conventions and customs. Then we have mores, which are more to do with norms of morality, what is morally good or morally bad. And the last, of course, is taboos, which are absolutely prohibited, usually by the laws of the country that has codified them, so to speak. But if we look at folk ways, concentrate on those for a second, there are very interesting examples. For example, when you go to somebody's house in India or Japan, it's quite typical that you take your shoes off and leave them outside the door. Now, in Anglo-Saxon cultures, this is less typical, of course, if not absolutely doesn't happen. So when you come to somebody's house, if you don't take your shoes off, you can risk offending the people. Other things, for example, many areas like bringing presents, for example. Once I was working with a woman from Taiwan, and for the company, we gave her a present, and she took the present and she said, "Thank you very much," very politely, and put it to one side. And we thought that was a bit strange because we're used to people opening presents when we give them. She took the present away without opening it. And about a day later, we got a message from her thanking us for the present. And looking into that, we discovered that present giving is different in Taiwan, for example, and in China. The present is not open because if it's opened in front of the client or in front of the person, there's a risk that you might show that you don't like the present. So in order to avoid this potential embarrassment, they tend to take the presents away with them.
This is very interesting as well. And I have my own examples of my own experiences. So while working at the Economist newspaper, we used to host many organizations and FTSE 100 companies and CEOs. And I remember very well once we had Samsung, for instance, they came to meet us, and when the procedures and the way we were greeting them with presents, again, it was very much, you need to take that into consideration. They're going to come and meet you, so you know they're going to give you a present, so you need to prepare a present, because otherwise it will be seen as rude, and the business deal could suffer. So of course, we're talking very much about Asian culture. There are different. You told me the other day something quite interesting about the penknife or the sword.
Again, that's in South Korea. It's considered very bad manners to give a sharp object as a present. So we might, let's imagine that you're giving them a ceremonial sword, or you're giving them a penknife with the logo of the company on it. Any sharp objects are considered to be very bad luck because it represents a cutting of ties between people. Simple things like that, or writing in red ink is considered to be very, very bad for these type of cultures, because red ink and writing in red ink is reserved for the names of the dead. So you can imagine if you started writing something in red ink, the reaction of the person, even though they understand some of your cultural differences, there's a gut reaction as well. And this is part of the problem with culture, is that this is part of what culture is. You react from an instinctive level, even though you are aware that people have different cultural understandings, yes, and yours might be alien to them.
So even if you prepare a presentation, for instance, it would be good to think about who your audience is, when you sort of using different colors. It's something so simple that we don't think about, but perhaps, again, understanding cultural norms is important.
Well, it was one or more two things, perhaps. In many cultures, again, in India, for example, the left hand is considered the unclean hand. So using the left hand, perhaps in a situation, it might be a meeting, to pass something, or even if you're left-handed, to shake hands, it can have a bad reaction because the hand is unclean. So instinctively, the people will react negatively. I was in India, in Sri Lanka, again, very similar culture. And when I was at the table eating, all the guests who were from Sri Lanka had their hands under the table. Literally, they were slightly bent as they were eating, so to keep the hand out of view even. So these are things that you need to pick up on very quickly and in order to integrate yourself more into these cultures.
Okay, this is all very interesting, and you're giving us these anecdotes which are fascinating, and I can talk about them forever, as we often do. But can you give us a little bit more sort of an academic approach to these theories, if there are any that come to mind?
Yes. Well, probably.
Before I do that, because we prepare a presentation, just to put a slide on, Judy, if you wouldn't mind projecting that slide as background while Alan starts. You can go.
Okay, so probably in the world of business communications at an academic level, Hofstede is very renowned, is very well known. He is a Dutch professor, I should say, was a Dutch professor. Unfortunately, he died recently, but he was very famous because he worked for IBM for many, many years, traveling the globe, many cultural interactions as a consequence, of course. He was a social psychologist, and he taught at Maastricht University. He taught organizational management, cross-cultural interactions, and intercultural interactions as well. And Hofstede came up with a model of 6 dimensions that we can use to look broadly at a culture, or how a culture is different between one and the other. These 6 dimensions are indicative. Nobody represents their culture 100%. Everybody have variations, but we're all affected in some way by our cultures. And in this way, I think the dimensions serve as a sort of a blueprint of a way of looking at a particular culture and how it differs from another. So can we put the slide up? The second slide.
So we're just going to show now on slide number 2 what those cultural dimensions are.
That's it.
And here we are.
So these are Hofstede's cultural dimensions. As you can see there, I'll just read through them quickly. So number 1 is power and distance. Number 2 is individualistic or collectivistic societies. Number 3 is masculinity, femininity. 4 is uncertainty avoidance. 5 is long-term, short-term orientation. And the last of the dimensions is indulgence and restraint. And of course, I need to explain these to you, so I'm going to go through each one individually.
Great. So you're going to stop projecting now, Judy, if you may. So tell us a little bit about what is power and distance, Alan?
Right. Well, in this dimension of Hofstede, the power and distance, if we think about it as a scale, so 0, of course, very low power distance, to 100. Very high power distance. Countries fall, broadly speaking, again, I want to emphasize this, I'm not saying that every country, every culture represents this 100%, but indicatively, there are differences overall. With power and distance, a high level, so up towards the high part of the scale, cultures accept power is unequally distributed, and they accept hierarchical order. As you go down the scale to the lower ends of that dimension, cultures strive to equalize the distribution of power. and they see inequalities as things that need to be addressed and changed. So if we look, for example, at a country like Russia, many people think of Russia in certain ways. We have stereotypical ideas. But if we look at the scale with regards to this particular dimension, Russia is very, very high on this aspect. So very centralized companies, strong hierarchies, and large gaps in compensation and authority and position within these companies. As a consequence, when you're doing business with countries like, for example, Russia, you might expect that even if you're talking to a director, you won't get decisions made in that moment, that the person will have to go away and move up the chain of command in order to be able to speak for the company. Okay.
So that just brings an example to mind, not quite on Russia, because I always think about my own experiences. But again, I was working with a client in Japan. It was a GN2O, Japanese National Tourism Organization. And I presented my deal to the people in the organization that they were going to use this solution, and I had absolutely no reaction whatsoever, whether they liked it, they didn't, I have no idea what was going to happen with this deal. Normally you get an indication of the client feedback, whether it's good, whether this is something that is going to be valuable to them or not. So I hear nothing. They say, thank you very much and goodbye. No indication of we'll get back to you next week, zero. And a week went by and 2 weeks went by and I didn't know what to do. Should I follow up? Do I wait? I don't want to appear to be too pushy with this group of people that I'm talking to. And 3 weeks later, I received an email saying, thank you very much. I would like to sign the deal, with no indication. But what Alan talked about is interesting. They wouldn't sort of give you an indication because everything had to go to the hierarchical organization. They had to go to the CEO to ask for their opinion. And when the CEO said yes, and then they were allowed to come and tell us this. You might be in a different business environment, perhaps here in Spain or maybe in France, and you may have more indication where that person who said, you know, I really like this, thank you very much, I'm going to talk to my CEO to get this sign up, but yes, it looks great, I think we potentially will move forward, I'll get back to you next week. So there is more communication, more certainty on that deal. So yeah. Interesting that to observe.
Very interesting, good point. Again, just to finish this, on the lowest part of the scale, on the power distance scale, we have flatter organizations, less hierarchy, of course, and a lot of the time supervisors and employees are considered almost on an equal footing, if not exactly an equal footing. This also comes across in dress code as well. I mean, if you look at hierarchical, you tend to find that you know, the top managers wear you know, suits and so on. The people working in the factory wear overalls and so on. But if you go to Sweden, for example, many companies actually insist that both directors and employees wear the same clothes. So it gives you an idea that, you know, it can also affect dress sense, what you're allowed to wear, and so on.
Wow, how interesting. How interesting. Okay, well, what is next? What's the second dimension, Alan?
The second dimension is individualistic and collectivistic societies. So, for example, again, there are obviously cultures that are very high individualistic and others that are very high collectivistic. On the scale, again, referring to the scale, if we're very high on the scale, we are indicating that cultures are more individualistic. And what does that mean? Well, it means that people are very much responsible for themselves, that or their very close family, but they're not really responsible for anyone further out beyond that sphere. Whereas in more collectivistic societies, low on the scale, there's an emphasis on being part of a larger unit. You know, all are interdependent, and they require loyalty. And also in the use of language, you hear much more the use of we as opposed to the use of I. So linguistically, that's also interesting. There was some research done, just to give a point about this, a few years ago, where applications for doctoral thesis for PhD courses in America were elicited, globally, of course, and they analyzed the letters that people sent. in order to apply for this course. And it was interesting that the American students used an awful lot of I. They said what they could contribute to the university, how their research was so important. It was very much to do with me. Whereas looking towards the east or eastern area of the world, Chinese students, for example, talked about what they could contribute to the university, how they could make university stronger, how they were looking forward to working with their companions and their fellow students and so on. So at that sort of level, you can see that there's a big difference.
So that's an interesting point as well, because something to keep in mind, if you apply for a job for an American company, you know that your emphasis on your applications will be on what you can bring to the company, because as Alan talked about. But if you happen to apply for a job for a Chinese company, for instance, then interesting how your language should be adapted to that organization and culture. So they're very good tips.
Well, just before we move on, other important points to understand here about this particular dimension is when you're in a highly individualistic culture, there's a valuation, a very high valuation on people's privacy and on their individual time and their freedom. So, for example, if you look at Britain, for example, it's quite high on the individualistic aspect because privacy is very important. So if you stop somebody in the street in Britain, you might, to ask, for example, where's the station? You might say something like, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you. Have you got a second, please? Would you mind telling me where the station is, if you possibly could? The language is there to show that you're intruding into somebody's private space, their private world. Where, interestingly, south of the Alps, in Italy and in Spain, from my personal experience, when you see somebody in the street and you want to ask the same question, you just say, the station? So the idea, again, this is a difference between Italy and Spain, obviously, are slightly lower down the scale and a little bit more sort of towards collectivistic. We work together. You see Italians going out to have a pizza. Usually there's 50 Italians having a pizza, not one or two or a couple, because the idea is that we're collectivistic more, that we all get together, that we invite all our friends and our family and we eat together. So again, you can see that playing out.
Yeah, so that's interesting. No, I had, and again, from a perspective of when I came back to Spain, my language, even on my own language, when I speak Spanish, I will adopt that, and I will say to someone in my own language, I'm really sorry, I'm looking for the station, or even in a business sense, it's like, if I'm going to talk, let's say, to my boss, I am so sorry to disturb you. May I please come in? I have 5 minutes, want to discuss with you. And they look at me like, come on, get on with it. What do you want? So they don't quite sort of understand that I'm so elaborate in my language, because again, my brain is going back to respecting that privacy, whether here is less respected and not respected, but it, again, is more, like you said, collectivistic. So interesting.
But also just again, on a business sense, I mean, if you go to a meeting, for example, if we compare perhaps an American going to Japanese company, for example. Again, America's got quite high individualistic traits, and of course, Japan more collectivistic. It's considered rude in Japan to jump straight into business. You have to, involve people more by asking them about their health. Did they have a nice holiday recently? Usually a big introduction. There's a big introduction into the meeting before you get to business. Whereas in an American situation, you might have few pleasantries. You might say, how's it going? How are you? How's the family? And then straight into business. Now, from the collectivistic point of view, that's considered very rude. But from the individualistic point of view, it's considering, what are we here for? We're here to do business, which can lead to negative evaluation of the person you're talking to. They don't want to talk about business immediately. This is why we're here. So again, they cause these cultural clashes in a business world.
Yes, very good point. So Alan, so what's the third dimension we're talking about masculinity and femininity? What does that mean in a business context?
Okay, this is not necessarily to do with gender, this is not to do with I'm a man, you're a woman, but it's to do with traits that are associated with masculinity in a social, cultural sense, and those that are associated with femininity. So in a masculinity, in the masculinity level, high, for example, there's a preference in society for achievement, for meeting goals, to a certain extent for heroism, assertiveness, and as a consequence of all these things, material rewards for what you do. Whereas in a femininity dimension, the feminine dimension, which is low on the scale, in Hofstede's scale anyway, there's a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and quality of life.
Well, what examples? What, do you have any countries or any examples? Because that's interesting.
Well, again, I hate to keep going back to it, but also Austria. Interesting enough, Austria is very high in the scale, almost more than America.
For masculinity?
For masculinity, yeah. But for example, on the lower level, Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden are very feminine in their approach to society. So, for example, if you look at the national healthcare system in America, it's a disaster. I mean, everything's private insurance and so on. But then if you go to Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, it's free for all and it's top quality. Because again, that dimension suggests that the society, the culture cares more for the weak.
It is kind of like more inclusive in a sense. Again, I think probably sometimes when I listen to these theories, I think that they're a little bit tied in together. A country that is more individualistic potentially is going to be more masculine in their approach. That brings to mind. So let's talk about the fifth one. I think I'm not messing my numbers, but I think we'll talk about 4. So this is the fifth: uncertainty avoidance.
Yeah, uncertainty avoidance, as you can imagine, it is what it says, that there are cultures that are more nervous about the future and other cultures that are less. If you're high in uncertainty avoidance, then you're a culture that is uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. You're intolerant to a certain extent of unorthodox behavior and ideas. There's a sense of being more rooted to the past than there is living in the present again. And again, if you're low on uncertainty avoidance, so it's the opposite, comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity to a certain extent, of course, and a sort of a general acceptance that, well, we can't control the future. So what we do today, is important to build the future, but we're not always worried about the consequences of those decisions that we make.
So how does this apply to business? Because of course, if I'm doing business with a client that it has a fear of the future, is that how do you explain it? I need to make sure that I'm listening every step of the way to get where we want to get doing business. Because if I know specific and clear, that might make the relationship uncomfortable. Is that what you saying?
Yeah, well, okay, in a business sense, a high level of uncertainty avoidancy, a country, for example, like Poland, I'm sure not many people will be very familiar with Polish social culture, but Poland is extremely high when it comes to uncertainty avoidance. So what you find is businesses have a very formal way of conducting their business. There are a lot of rules and a lot of policies that constantly have to be respected. They need and they expect structure. So if you're going into dealings with them, you'd have to be very structured and very clear about your objectives. And all differences are avoided. The whole idea is that you work together for this general aim. However, if you look at a country like Denmark, for example, which is very low on this particular scale, informal business attitudes are much more common. There's more concern with long-term strategy than what is happening on a daily basis. And they're more accepting of change and risk. So again, if you're working between Poland and Denmark, you would find that in Poland, very strict, very organized, policy, rules have to be respected. But you find much more flexibility, perhaps, if you're working for a Danish company
Interesting. So sometimes okay, this is just kind of general comments, absolutely. But if you think about Denmark, again, it could be a bit more innovative. They could be more entrepreneurial, perhaps in their approach, more experimenting with different models and different business attitudes. This is interesting.
Well, I think, yeah, there'd be more again, I keep going back to the same statement that these are generalizations, and we don't look at a graph and we say this country, everybody in it behaves in this way. Everybody has different cultural experiences of life. They travel, especially in this globalized world. They have lots of experiences they bring back. But generally speaking, we can say there are rough guidelines that tend to be respected in general. Okay. Yeah.
Great. And now we go into the last dimension.
Penultimate.
You see, me and numbers, Judy. Okay, penultimate, which is, Alan, I lost my
long-term, short-term orientation. This is very similar to the prior dimension as well, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with Hofstede 100%, but again, it's a dimension that has some variation. So long-term, short-term orientations are cultures, as it says, that, you know, either look much more into the future for their business or look more towards the present and how the present is developing in the moment. So, for example, if you get a high score in this, if you're sort of very long-term orientated in your cultural approach to business, things like the family is the basis of society. Parents are more respected and have more authority. There's a very strong work ethic. High values based on education and training, for example. Whereas if you're on the lower level, more towards the short-term orientation, then there's much more promotion of equality. High creativity, actually, and more individualism as well are two important factors. And the sort of idea that you treat others as you expect to be treated yourself. These are areas that sort of overlap with what we've just been talking about before, but interesting, I think.
Yeah. So you had an example about Canada, is that right? How they sort of they feed around sort of more kind of.
No, I was actually thinking of Russia again.
Okay.
Russia is extremely high on this. I mean, a very long-term orientation. You would think with all the trouble and strife and revolutions they've had, perhaps that's one of the reasons why. They're very focused on long-term orientation. So again, if you look at the lower end of the scale, then for example, Finland, which is next door, Russia and Finland, they're geographically, you know, together almost on the same plane. But in Finland, it's very low, for example. They have a much more short-term orientation in their cultural approach to business as well.
Great. And that brings us to the last dimension.
So I hope we haven't overloaded you with all these dimensions. But the last one is indulgence and restraint. Basically, here we're talking about cultures that sort of celebrate life much more, enjoying life. They see that the free gratification of basic and natural human drives are appreciated and promoted within that society. Having fun is very important. So, for example, Canada is quite high on this score, tends to have that orientation, whereas Hong Kong, for example, is quite low on this scale. And when you're low on the scale, this means suppressing gratification, especially of the needs, and it's regulated by strict norms of society. So the idea of going out and partying and enjoying life is slightly frowned upon in these cultures, as opposed to the other, Canada, for example.
This is interesting because, again, it brings to mind sort of some ex-colleagues that I have from Hong Kong, and even sort of when they describe how they study as children and then as young adults, the amount of hours they put in is probably very different to the way I studied. So I studied and I worked hard to do my studies. But again, almost for them, it was absolutely no play, no being a child in a sense, in the way I think it was from my culture. So they are so much more focused and dedicated in absolutely work and this. So again, perhaps when you do business with these cultures is that sense of, or if you work for that type of organization, you're expected to give a lot more than perhaps your own culture would defer.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about business practices, for example, if you go to Italy, it's quite normal if you're having a business meeting that at some point, quite early on, perhaps in the meeting, or even before the meeting starts, to have dinner together or have lunch together. Other cultures would find that very strange, that perhaps in Germany, you might have something to eat after the meeting. So business before pleasure, so to speak. So you get these different approaches to, you know, what it is to do business. For example, again, in Korea and Japan and so on, you tend to get again a low score here. It's more to do with suppressing gratification in the working environment. So what you get is, you know, I believe this is also a common trope that there's a word in Japanese for killing yourself by work, but it doesn't exist in many other cultures. Mm-hmm. But what you tend to find is that when they're working, they work long hours, they're very, very focused, very little pleasures involved. But on the weekends, for example, you might find that they blow out. They go to bars and they get extremely drunk, or they do very silly things. Not to say that all this culture is the same, but there tends to be a very heavy sort of partying part to their lives, which focuses on excess, because most of their lives is based on the suppression of gratification.
Well, how very interesting.
Show a quick slide?
Yes, so we have a slide. All this information, you find it interesting, that you can play with it. We're going to show you a slide that it has that graph comparison that often talks about. And often what you could do, just out of interest, and again, take this with a pinch of salt, because it's not sort of, as Alan mentioned, 100% that's what everybody is to that culture, but that's that tendency to it. So I put a little link to this website as well that you can access yourselves and play with it and put different countries and see how different countries compare to each other. Sometimes it's quite fun. But yes, so Judy now is going to show us.
Please, Eva, tell me when it's projecting, because I can't see here. It's downloading. It shows me that it's downloading.
Yes, so we're seeing the first slide.
Just give it a second for it to transition to the next. Sorry.
No problem.
No problem.
Again, while we're waiting for the slide, I would just make the point here that, again, by using these dimensions, it is more like a heuristic. It's a way of sensitizing us to potential differences between cultures, and especially in the working environment. It's not a given that they will conform completely to some academics' analysis of that culture, but there will be strong tendencies, I think. So it helps us reflect more than anything else.
Yes, so the next slide, please.
It's still transitioning. It's really slow here. I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
Now, when we show the slide, we'll go to questions.
That's it. That's it.
We got it. So here,
okay, I'm just going to keep the slides because it takes too long for it to download. So I'm just going to keep it until the end of the session. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Can we move that? I can't see.
No.
Right.
Okay. So here we're comparing, sorry, I can't see this because that's the projection. Okay. So yeah, so you can see the slide, you have the comparison of the 6 D models. And you see the difference here between the United States and Russia, for instance, the examples that we picked. And again, we will be distributing these slides, so you can, I mean, it's only a couple of them, and you can go a little bit deeper into that website if you wish.
Yeah, just on a practical note, the site is interesting because you can put in the countries that you're interested in and compare them. So literally, as you start to write the country in the box you see there, it'll come up, you can click on it, and it'll give you the graphic representation for the model for that particular culture. And you can choose up to, I'm not sure, 3, 4, even more, and it'll give you the differences between them all. And then below that, which you can't see here, you can actually go to a report, because there are lots of reports. So if you've chosen 2 countries, you can actually click on a link and it'll bring you to a report about some of the finer aspects of the differences between these cultures. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. That was very interesting.
So.
So we got sort of about 15 minutes, and maybe we went a bit too long, but we'd love to take questions from the floor, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you so much, Eva and Alan. Thank you for being with us here. It's a really interesting topic. I could literally listen to you all day and not get enough of it. Thank you. We can take questions now. I see that Mahmoud has raised his hand. Mahmoud, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Judy, thank you, Dr. James and Eva. That was a wonderful session. I also enjoyed, and I cannot say more than what Judy said. I have a 2-piece question, and maybe they are related. The first one is it professional to address someone by or greet them in their own language and in a business email? Like in Japanese, could you, for example, if you know their last name, could you say like their last name San? Or is it unprofessional to do that? Or like when you want to thank them in their own language?
Yeah, I'd be very careful with names. So I didn't catch your name. What's your name, sir?
Mahmoud.
Mahmoud. You've got to be very careful with names. Again, to do with this cultural dimension. I know more Chinese culture, more perhaps than Japanese, but I think it's very similar. The surname, sorry, the first name is only for family members, very close family, and the surname is for general business. What you find a lot is that, especially in Chinese, in South Korea and so on, they tend to change their first names to English versions. Mm-hmm. And this is to avoid embarrassment on their side, because it's not because you can't pronounce the name Lee, for example. You can, but it's considered not for business. It's considered only for private and family life. So when you're using names, I'll be very careful. If they introduce themselves as David, or they actually use their first name in correspondence, then yes, okay, that's fine. But if they don't, I would avoid trying to translate.
But if I may add, and if I understand, you also talked about the question, the other side of the question is like, can we use their own language? So for instance, say bonjour or buenos dias. I think this is fine, and I think some people will find it endearing that you address their own language. And I often, even when I was in Britain, some people will, when some clients or some business dealings that I would have, they would sort of address me and they would say, "Buenos dias, Eva." I think it's a way of getting closer to their own culture. So in that sense, yes, like Alan said, when we talk about Asia, I think the norms tend to be so strict that it is better to check that you don't get it wrong. But
well, I wouldn't use Google Translate. that might be you might make a big error there. That would be very insulting. But if you know the language, if you know some of the language, usually it's very appreciated if you can use it in your conversation. Even little expressions, for example. I mean, in my business world, if I use a little expression that I know and I can pronounce properly in the language, it opens doors. People become very open to you because they feel you're making an effort. That you're not just standing in your cultural space, you're trying to bridge it a bit by linguistically engaging with them, by showing that you know a bit of their language. It's quite a good opener sometimes to build relationships with a bit of the language.
Thank you.
Is it okay if it is in written communication like email, or is it not considered professional to say like
again? Yes, I think like I talked last week, if you're not sure, don't do it. Play it safe. If you're not sure, perhaps the first time you're greeting someone, I wouldn't. So if they don't know you, perhaps don't use it so much because you don't know the other person. And then when you have built a relationship, and then you know that person, so then yes, it's fine. But you have to ask them.
Your voice is gone.
I think we lost you at the end.
So sorry, what I said is that it's better to play it safe if you're not sure. So at first, just try and build a relationship before you move into be more adventurous with your communication. Do you have any other questions?
I have just a quick one about femininity and masculinity. If you're not sure about if the person is Mr., Mrs., or Miss, because they have a different culture or different name, what is the safest way to address them in an email?
Okay, so in an email, so if it's obviously, if we know that the name, this is interesting because sometimes, normally, so if I say that Alan, you know, Alan is Mr. because he's a man, it's clear that the name Alan is not a feminine name. Again, in Japan, for instance, it's very difficult to know. Sometimes is that if they're actually a man or a woman. So if you say Mr. Lee, Lee could be a man or Lee could be a woman. And I have had that problem sometimes of not knowing the gender. So I had to really Google them. And hopefully a picture will appear or maybe some news on Google about that person. And I go, okay, so I know he's a woman, so I can say Miss. Now, I wouldn't use Mrs. because you don't know. So to play safe, always use, for when you address a lady, always use a Miss, no Mrs. And a man is just, there is just one greeting, it's Mr.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Eva and Alan. Reda has a question. She raised her hand. Reda, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. At first, thank you for that informative session. My question is, if I started to work with a company from another culture, what aspects that I have to take into consideration at the start?
Again, based on what we talked about today, I think you can start by looking at, for example, Hofstede. Look at some of the aspects. Have I understood the question?
Yes, yes.
Looking at some of the aspects there. If you know anybody who's worked with those cultures before, that's even better. Sometimes you can find things on the internet, blogs and discussions about different cultures that give you some idea about some of the strange things that people experience with those cultures. There's always something out there. If a little bit of research on your side is always a good idea to start the process. Again, if you know anyone personally, or if you can go on the internet and find some blog or people talking about their experiences working for that culture, it can give you some insight perhaps onto how they're different from your own, for example.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ali has his hand raised. Ali, you can go ahead, ask your question, please.
Hi, Ali.
Ali, are you with us?
Yes, yeah. Hello.
Hello, Ali.
Hi, Ali.
Yeah, I noticed that sometimes for communication is just like talking about the cultures and protocols.
Sorry.
Yes, I think you're in mute, Ali. I think so. We just got the first part of the question. So communication is about culture and protocols.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, when we go, sometimes you notice that in business deals, they try to make the culture or the environment for the place where they are going to do sometimes greeting or for official visits, making the environment just like the second party environmental place. Let's say, for example, for Chinese, they bring them their decorations and their Chinese tea cups on this. So, what do you think of such activities when are done for official visits or even for signing contracts with the clients?
This is okay. I've been in that situation many times, and it's really important to respect those customs. Just they might not be offended, but I think it will really open doors, and they will be sensitive that you sort of adapted the customs. And again, for instance, I'll give you an example. I had a group of people coming from Japan to visit us. I was very aware how they have to sit at a table. So before they arrived, I made sure that they had a name tag. So maybe you meet in with someone from the USA or from Britain. It doesn't matter. People just come in and sit down in the ballroom, whatever they like. But in their culture, you need to make sure that the CEO is placed in the middle of the table. And then the CEO of the company that they're visiting sits right opposite them. So it's that, CEO in front of CEO. And then normally they come with a big group of people, an entourage of the company, and you need to sit them together in such a way that to the right hand side of the CEO will be the number 2 of the company, on the left hand side the number 3, and then in that hierarchical order in the table. Then again, in the UK, for instance, I remember this very well. We went to buy tea that it was actually British tea because there was something nice for them to try. We went to Fortnum & Mason, it's a well-known store in the UK that they have these lovely teas, and we wanted to give them this present. Another thing is very important is to understand when they come in, the first thing they like to do when you greet them is that you next to the CEO with everybody around, and they like to take a picture, because then they take that picture back and they want to show it in the company, the visit, and so on. And then when you greet them, the first thing you do is you bow, of course, and you hold your business card. The first thing you do before anything else, you give them your business card, and you hold the business cards with your 2 hands, offer it to them as you bow. So this kind of procedures, if you know and understand them, I think again they're extremely valuable in how you're starting a good start and everybody feels comfortable. So,
and I will just add with the business card, for example, it's also important to actually show that you're reading it.
Yes,
they will look at your card as well, because they want to know where you are in the hierarchical position in the company. So that's also an important aspect, I think.
Yes, it's true, because sometimes you might give your business card in another different country or culture, and you go, thanks very much, and then you put it in your pocket, and that's okay, and then you look at it later. But again, for a Japanese person, again, when they give you the card, you need to read it and acknowledge and say, okay, I read it, I know who you are, and I know your position. Thank you very much.
Again, this is to do with collectivistic societies, because in the business world in Japan, you're part of the organization, not perhaps family, but you represent part and all of the company in the same time. So in more American situations, you might be a bit more blasé, a little bit more, well, I'm the assistant director or whatever, but the position in the company is also very important in collectivistic society.
Now, how do the other second party look at it when you do it in this way to them? Do they look that it is respectful, or is it like you are trying to reach to somewhere?
No, not at all. I don't think so. I think it's actually, in some ways, it brings them a lot of comfort that you do that and you respect that, because sometimes if you don't respect that, they will feel very uncomfortable. If you, let's say the example I'm giving you about sitting the CEO in front of the CEO and everybody in that hierarchical order, if you don't do that, they're going to feel very uncomfortable in that meeting, because that's not how they work. Okay, we're talking about cultures that they're very traditionally in the culture of doing business. There are others that they're a little bit more, it doesn't matter, you know, they haven't addressed the fact that I like to talk about the weather before I actually go into business. So there are some, maybe in Europe, there are less strong differences. When we're talking about Asian cultures and Western, maybe it is a little bit more complex. But don't ever feel that they will feel offended by you making a gesture, because think about yourself and your own culture, for instance. So if I'm going to do business with you, and if I address the way your culture is and the way you feel comfortable about doing business, if I do that, the likelihood is that you won't feel offended. You feel kind of glad that I've understood your culture, and I'm following some kind of norms of doing business with you. So I think it's a welcome thing. Never be afraid to show your sensitivities to other cultures.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Eva, I have a question. Have you ever done business with Middle Easterns? I want to know how we are perceived. I know the possibility of you doing business with Saudi Arabia is almost non-existent. So have you ever done business with Middle Easterns?
Actually, I don't have that many examples. I have done business in Dubai, but maybe more sort of like meetings as opposed to having a client that I had to go through a whole business deal process. So here, actually, this is what, from my perspective, and maybe not today because we might not have time, but I really love to hear your thoughts, because you is your own culture and you know more or less sort of what your customs are like, and I love to learn more from you on this.
And also,
Sure.
you might put it in the Hofstede, put your country in the Hofstede model and see if you agree or disagree with how they position you in relation to these things. It might be interesting.
This is true, because again, you might disagree or you might agree. So you can write to them and say, we don't agree.
Yeah, sure. I'll have a look at that. Well, thank you so much, Eva and Alan. Thank you for being with us here this morning. It was really an insightful session. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you to everybody for coming.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
I'll go. We'll see you later. Bye.
Bye. Bye.